November 6, 2018, election night in Florida. Millions of voters have just made a decision that will change American democracy forever. Amendment 4 passes with 64% of the vote. In a single night, over 1.4 million formerly incarcerated Floridians regain their right to vote. It's the largest expansion of voting rights in America since women gained suffrage in 1920. But to understand how one man changed American democracy, you have to know how close he came to losing everything, even his life. The man who made it all possible? He's watching the returns from a cramped campaign office, tears streaming down his face. His name is Desmon Meade. 15 years earlier, he was serving time in a Florida prison for gun possession. Before that, he was homeless on the streets of Miami, a drug addict that society had written off. He had just rewritten the Florida Constitution, from a prison cell to changing state law. This is that story. St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. 1967. Desmond Meade was born into paradise, but paradise doesn't guarantee a perfect life. When Desmond was 6 years old, his family moved to Florida, chasing the American dream. His parents worked hard to provide for their children, believing that opportunity and education could overcome any obstacle. For a while, it seemed to work. Desmond was a good student, an athlete, a kid with potential. After high school, he joined the Army, serving his country with pride and honor. But military service in the 1980s came with exposure to dangers that had nothing to do with combat. It was during his time in the Army that Desmond was first introduced to cocaine. What started as experimentation became dependency. What began as recreational use evolved into full-blown addiction. By the time Desmond completed his military service, he was fighting a battle he didn't know how to win. Cocaine addiction doesn't discriminate. It consumes everyone in its path: rich, poor, educated, military veterans. For Desmond, it marked the beginning of a downward spiral that would cost him everything. The transition from veteran to addict was swift and devastating. Jobs became impossible to hold. Relationships crumbled under the weight of addiction. The young man who had served his country with honor was disappearing into the chaos of substance abuse. By the 1990s, Desmond's life had become a series of increasingly desperate attempts to feed his addiction. Minor crimes, petty theft, each arrest making the next one more likely, each conviction making recovery more difficult. In 1995, his mother died. Shortly after, the family home was foreclosed. The last connections to stability were severing one by one. Desmond was spiraling toward rock bottom, but he hadn't hit it yet. Desmond Meade was staying at a friend's house when police arrived with a search warrant. They found a gun in the cupboard. According to Desmond, it belonged to the homeowner, not to him. But the police testified that they found Desmond holding the weapon. For someone with his criminal history, the charge was devastating: possession of a firearm as a convicted felon. Under Florida's strict sentencing guidelines, it carried serious time: 15 years in state prison. At 34 years old, Desmond faced the possibility that he would spend the next decade and a half behind bars. By the time he got out, he'd be pushing 50. Most of his adult life consumed by a system designed to punish, not rehabilitate. Prison gave him something he hadn't had in years: clarity. Without drugs clouding his judgment, without the constant pressure of finding his next fix, Desmond could finally see his life clearly. He began to understand that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing. That the criminal justice system was treating symptoms, not causes. That punishment without treatment was just expensive warehousing. Most importantly, he began to envision a different future. Desmond served 11 years of his 15-year sentence, earning early release through good behavior. But walking out of prison in 2012 didn't mean walking into freedom. He was 45 years old. He had no job, no place to live, no support system. Miami's sidewalks became his bed. Dumpsters became his source of food. After 11 years in prison, Desmond Meade found himself homeless on the streets of the city where he'd grown up. This was supposed to be his second chance. Instead, it felt like a death sentence with extra steps. Homelessness after prison is a special kind of hell. You've paid your debt to society, but society refuses to accept payment. Employers won't hire you, landlords won't rent to you. Social services treat you like a problem to be managed, not a human being to be helped. Desmond spent months on Miami's streets, sleeping in doorways, scrounging for food, watching other formerly incarcerated people cycle back into the system. The barriers to re-entry were so overwhelming that crime often seemed like the only viable option. But Desmond had learned something during his years in prison. He understood that individual choices mattered, but so did systemic barriers. Personal responsibility was important, but so was social responsibility. One day, while sitting in a library to escape the heat, Desmond encountered something that would change his life. He learned about educational opportunities for formerly incarcerated people, programs designed to help people like him rebuild their lives through knowledge and skills. He enrolled in classes at Miami-Dade College, beginning with basic courses he should have taken decades earlier: paralegal studies, criminal justice, courses that gave him language for the experiences he'd lived. But more than that, education gave him hope. Desmond excelled at college. His life experiences gave him perspectives that enriched every discussion. His determination drove him through challenges that would have stopped other students. He completed his paralegal certification, then his bachelor's degree. Then something extraordinary happened. Florida International University College of Law accepted him into their program. A formerly homeless convicted felon was going to law school. The transformation was remarkable, but it came with a cruel irony. Florida law prohibited convicted felons from practicing law, regardless of their education or rehabilitation. Desmond could earn his law degree, but he couldn't use it to help others navigate the system that had nearly destroyed him. More importantly, as a convicted felon, Desmond couldn't vote. He had no voice in choosing the lawmakers who created the policies affecting his life. That's when Desmond realized individual transformation wasn't enough. The system itself needed to change. In 2014, Desmond founded the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. The mission was simple but revolutionary: restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated Floridians who had completed their sentences. Florida was one of only 4 states that permanently disenfranchised people with felony convictions. Over 1.4 million Floridians, roughly 10% of the adult population, couldn't vote because of past criminal convictions. Most of these people had completed their sentences years earlier. They were working, paying taxes, raising families, and contributing to their communities. But they had no voice in democracy. Desmond understood that voting rights weren't just about politics. They were about dignity, citizenship, and the fundamental belief that people could change. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition began as a grassroots organization with virtually no resources. Desmond and a handful of other formerly incarcerated advocates started organizing in churches, community centers, and living rooms across the state. Their message was simple: people who have paid their debt to society deserve a voice in that society. The opposition was fierce. Conservative politicians argued that voting was a privilege that could be permanently forfeited. Law enforcement organizations claimed that restored voting rights would somehow encourage crime. But Desmond and his team had something their opponents lacked: authenticity. They weren't advocating for theoretical formerly incarcerated people. They were formerly incarcerated people advocating for themselves and their communities. The campaign to pass Amendment 4 took 4 years of relentless organizing: voter registration drives, community education, legislative lobbying, legal challenges. By 2018, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition had built a movement that crossed party lines, racial boundaries, and geographic divisions. Amendment 4 needed 60% of the vote to pass, a high bar for any constitutional amendment. Polls showed the race tightening as Election Day approached. November 6, 2018. Election night. Desmond and his team gathered in a cramped campaign office to watch the returns. Early results looked promising. But in Florida, close elections have a way of becoming recounts and legal challenges. Then, at 8:47 p.m., the Associated Press called the race. Amendment 4 had passed with 64.55% of the vote. Over 5.1 million Floridians had voted to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated citizens. It was a landslide victory that crossed every demographic boundary. In a single night, Florida had gone from one of the most restrictive states for voting rights to one of the most inclusive. Over 1.4 million people would regain their voice in democracy. Desmond wept. 11 years earlier, he'd been homeless on Miami's streets. Now he just helped engineer the largest expansion of voting rights in a generation. But the victory came with complications. The Florida legislature immediately began working to undermine Amendment 4, passing laws requiring formerly incarcerated people to pay all court fees and fines before regaining voting rights. The battle wasn't over. Desmon Meade stands as one of America's most respected voices on voting rights and criminal justice reform. Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2019. He's received the Brown Democracy Medal from Penn State University and the Champion of Justice Award from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He's been featured in documentaries, written op-eds for major newspapers, and spoken at conferences around the world. But the accolades aren't what drives Desmond. What drives him is the knowledge that over 1 million Floridians now have a voice in their democracy because of the movement he helped build. The Florida Rights Restoration Coalition has expanded far beyond voting rights. Under Desmond's leadership, it provides job training, educational opportunities, and reentry support to formerly incarcerated people across Florida. The organization has become a national model for grassroots organizing and criminal justice reform. Other states have adopted similar initiatives based on Florida's success. Desmond has also become a powerful voice for broader criminal justice reform. He speaks regularly about the need to treat addiction as a public health issue, not a criminal justice problem. About the importance of rehabilitation over punishment, about the economic and moral arguments for giving people second chances. His law degree, while not allowing him to practice in Florida due to his record, has given him expertise to advocate effectively for policy changes. From St. Croix to military service, to addiction, to 15 years in prison, to homelessness, to law school, to changing the Florida Constitution. That's the Desmond Meade story. If you believe in second chances, prove it right now. Smash that like button. Subscribe, because these are the stories no one else is telling. And if you know someone who needs hope, share this video with them today.